Today is November 30th, last day of November, which is amazing. Um, we'll have live classes for just about 2 more weeks. Our last day of live classes will be December 15th, and then we'll take Christmas break and pick up sometime after New Year. I'm not sure. I'm not sure when we're going to pick up because I have a class of my own in January where I'm the student, and it meets 3 hours a day, 4 days a week, for 3 weeks. So I'm going to be pretty busy in early January, and I think I might wait until I'm done with that class around January 20th to get back to live classes. So 2 more weeks, and then we'll take a break, and then I have to decide when we're going to resume live classes, but it'll probably be about halfway through January. Okay. But today we're going to get started with our first live class studying classical geometry and astronomy. We're going to study Euclid's Elements, which is the classic text on ancient geometry. And then if we get through Euclid's Elements pretty well, or as we get through it, we'll take some time to get started with classical astronomy as well, which is interesting. Not because we're going to be astronomers, that's really not what it's for, but because it is necessary to help us to study philosophy. Now, before I get started here today, I want to comment on this live class, because when I look at the registration for this live class, I've announced this class for several weeks now. And as of today, we've got 5 students in this live class meeting, and all 5 of them are girls. And I think that we need to look at this and realize that, in modern Catholic society, everyone's always criticizing the Catholic schools. Everyone's complaining that there are no priests, there's no religious vocations and all this stuff. Complaining about education, complaining about how far everything has fallen since the good old days. And yet, for all that complaining, when a classics teacher with 25 years of experience studying and teaching classical studies from a Christian perspective offers to teach students real classical liberal arts, real classical geometry, the way it was studied throughout history, the result is that we have 5 students registered for a live class, and it's always girls. So here we have 5 girls registered. Most of my time in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, even though these are philosophical studies, the most rigorous academic studies, most of the time, especially as we get into advanced studies, I'm working with girls. And if we think back through history, it was never the case that girls were the ones doing these studies. These were studies pursued by boys, really, because if you think about it, girls can study these things, but girls can't become priests. And so this philosophical education and formation, which was always considered a necessary part of preparation for the Catholic priesthood or philosophical work and things like that, we find no boys. It's good to know that Josh is listening. Good. But you understand my point. My point is, we look at this and we have to ask, where are the Catholic boys? Where are the Catholic boys? Why are the Catholic boys not studying the classical liberal arts? Why are they not studying philosophy? Why are they not studying classical languages? It really doesn't make much sense. I think we might have another one joining here. But you understand my point. And I think it's important for you as you grow up as Catholics, because as you grow up, you're going to hear Catholics complaining all the time about the state of things. But when you look at the opportunities that Catholics have, it's easy to see that when opportunities are made available, for all the talk, for all the complaining, they don't take advantage of opportunities when they are made available. And this has been my experience in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. When I started the Classical Liberal Arts Academy back in 2008, so 15 years ago, I really believed when I started it that the Catholic community just didn't understand what they should study. I really believed that the problems with Catholic education were simply due to ignorance, that they didn't understand classical Catholic education. And if the opportunity was made available, then the problems would all be solved because the Catholics would begin going back to real studies and going back to classical Catholic education. So I thought it was a simple case of innocent ignorance. They just didn't understand. And then as I started the Classical Liberal Arts Academy and started working with Catholic families and talking to Catholic families, I very quickly realized that it's convenient to complain about modern Catholic culture. It's very convenient to complain, but it's not true that if alternatives were made available, Catholics would choose them. In fact, I think many Catholics like to be in a place where they do the same thing everyone else does, but they complain about doing it as they do it, as if they disapprove of it, and yet they continue doing it. And when alternatives are made available and all the excuses are taken away, they still don't do it. And so I want you to see this as a good opportunity as you grow up in the Catholic Church to see that the complaining that you'll often run into among Catholics is really a bunch of hot air. They complain about the state of things because they're just blaming other people. And then if they're asked, what are you doing to fix this? What are you doing to change this? We'll just find excuses. You could say, well, we can't afford that. We can't afford to have our kids. These classes are free. These classes are free to attend. So no one can blame finances. I make the whole academy available to students for $25 a month. There's no financial excuse to not give a child a classical Catholic education. And I do that on purpose for this reason, to take away the excuses. But I just want you to see this. We're offering live classes for Catholic children, free live classes with a teacher who's been working for 25 years studying and teaching the classical liberal arts, and we get 5, 6 registrations among thousands of students in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. And yet, if I offer a class to teach, let's say, modern math or modern biology, we'll have 30 students registered for the class, 50 students registered for the class, as if there's something to gain for Catholic students from modern math and science studies. There's just this disrespect and avoidance of traditional Catholic studies. And we can take all the excuses away. We can take the costs away. We can make it available in your own home even. And we'll find that for all the talk, Catholics really aren't interested. They don't show up for these things. So good for you for being here. And I think you'll find these lessons very helpful. But I just want you to take a minute and learn a good life lesson about life as a Catholic, because as you grow up, you'll hear plenty of complaining and criticism. But when you look and ask, who's actually here to fix things, you'll find very, very few people actually willing to do anything different, to go beyond the minimum requirements, or actually imitate the studies of the saints. Very, very few people. And like I said, usually it's almost all girls. For some reason, girls get into it. Girls make progress. Girls are studying classical languages. Girls even get into philosophy and theology studies. I don't know where all the Catholic boys are or what they're doing. Well, this is another problem, Serena. We'll have Catholics complain about feminism and stuff like that. They'll complain that, for example, Pope Francis may be talking with different groups who want women to be able to become deacons in the church, and everybody will go crazy and complain that we can't have women doing things. But when you open a class and say, hey, if anyone would like to study philosophy or theology or would like to study classical liberal arts, come join us, a bunch of girls show up. So if girls end up being the most educated people in society, this problem that appears to exist in the church, um, it's not the fault of girls, it's the fault of the boys. I don't know where the boys are or what silly studies they're working on. I'm sure they're all planning on being engineers and doctors and lawyers and everything else, but in my Catholic life, I rarely run into all of these Catholic engineers and doctors and lawyers, so I don't know where they go. But everyone's excuse for not pursuing more serious Catholic studies seems to be that they're all going to become famous professionals who change the whole world, and yet everywhere we look, we find institutions being run by non-Catholics. So I just don't know where all the boys are or where they go, and I don't know why girls are the ones motivated to study philosophy rather than boys. So anyway, I think it's a good lesson for you as you grow up, just to see, the Catholic boys, and of course it's partly their parents' fault, or mostly their parents' fault. They're anxious about worldly things, they're anxious about careers and all this talk, and they don't even understand how to pursue those careers, because the colleges and professional institutions are not even looking for kids who spend all their time in modern math and science classes, and it won't even help them. So it's a good life lesson, a good practical lesson, to see a small group mostly consisting of girls in a study that should be filled with Catholic boys. Okay, and that's not any criticism against the girls, because this is an opportunity for girls that through much of history wasn't available. St. Thomas More was considered pretty radical because he gave his daughter a classical education, and she was a very well educated girl. That was rare. That usually wasn't available for girls. But in our society, we have girls taking advantage of these opportunities, and I have no idea where the Catholic boys are. So it's a good lesson, and I wanted to talk about that, to challenge especially Catholic parents to ask themselves what they're thinking as they complain that there are no priests in the church, there are no vocations, and yet when we have these classical studies, there are no Catholic boys to be found anywhere. I see we may have one or two here today, and that's great, but there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of boys studying in the academy who have seen these announcements that there are going to be free live classes for classical geometry, and none of them show up. So no excuses, okay? Having said all that, we're going to get into the study of classical geometry today, which is a great study. Most people in modern society don't understand what it's for. So today, what I'm going to do to introduce us to this study and kind of set the foundation for us to work in or work on, I'd like to talk about what geometry actually is, and give you, some goals for, what you should actually pursue and think about as you study geometry. Because like I said, most people don't understand why ancient wise men spent so much time and energy studying geometry. Okay, so what I'm going to do is share my screen here, and I'll just make sure we're all aware of what class this is for. Let me share my screen. All right, so up on the screen, you see that the course that we're talking about in the Academy is Classical Geometry 1, and you can see it's got this little core label next to it. There are modern courses on the Academy Study Center that are meant just to help students check the boxes for modern requirements. They're not meant to be the focus of anyone's studies. But the classes that are marked as core, labeled as core courses, they're the real classical liberal arts courses, okay? So this is course number 321 under the quadrivium, and you see the title is Classical Geometry 1, all right? So that's the course that you should be enrolled in to get the work done for this study. And in these live classes, I'm going to be going through this and help you to make the best progress possible. And when I say the best progress, what I mean by that, and some of you may already be into this course, a number of lessons into this course, but what frustrates me as a teacher is seeing students have to go through a process of submitting an assignment, the assignment not being very good, having it sent back to them, then they have to edit it, they have to resubmit it, then they have to wait to have it regraded. That time of going back and forth and the effort that it takes to go back and forth like that is really a terrible waste of time, not just for students, but also for me. And with these live classes, I'd like to try to eliminate that. What I'd really like is to walk through these lessons, explain things, and then have students go and study and submit their assignments, complete their assessments, and just nail it on the first try, just to eliminate all that unnecessary time and effort of going back and forth and waiting for grades and all that kind of stuff. So that's really what I see as the benefit of these classes. It can really help you to progress better by helping you to understand the point of the lessons, to have the lessons explained, and then be able to go and complete the lessons, the assignments, confident that you know what the questions are seeking, giving all the right answers, getting approved and passed the first time, and then just moving on to the next lesson. So my real concern is helping you with the quality and the speed at which you can get these lessons done without being sloppy and cutting corners, to really have quality, but to also have speed. Okay, so we're going to be going through all the content for Classical Geometry 1. Now, what I said was I want to lay a foundation for this study, and I'm going to share a link with you. You don't have to open this because I'm going to have these things on my screen, but I think it might be good for you to have this link here. Rather than give you a bunch of links to follow, what I'm going to do, which is more intelligent, I don't know why I didn't think of this before, I'm just going to make a document for each class that has links to the resources we use for the class. Okay, so that document there has 5 links on it, and this is all the content we're going to talk about in our class today. So as long as you have access to that document, you can get all the stuff you see me share today, you can easily access. Okay, so I just shared that the first link just takes you to the geometry course to make sure you know what course we're working on. Make sure you're enrolled in that course. If you're already subscribed to the Academy, you don't have to pay for any other enrollment. So if I tell you to add this course, you don't have to worry about your parents having to pay more money or anything like that. That's one of the reasons why I use subscriptions for enrollment, so we don't have to limit courses to what parents can afford. So the link to the course is right there. And then we're going to take a look quickly at the chronology of ancient mathematicians again, which we looked at the other day, because this study of classical geometry, we study an author named Euclid, and I want you to see where he is in history. So if we look at this chronology of ancient mathematicians, which starts way back in the ancient world with the Babylonians and Egyptians, the author of this geometry book is Euclid. And if you look at his the time that he lived, 325 to 265, you see that he lived right after Aristotle. Okay, Aristotle died in 322. And what's important about Aristotle, the reason why Aristotle's life is so important in chronology is because remember, Aristotle's student was Alexander, and Alexander grew up and went on to conquer the whole world. So Alexander brought all of this Greek culture and philosophy all through the world, all through the Eastern nations, through Israel, through Egypt, through Babylon and Assyria and Persia, all the way out to India in the 4th century before Christ. So Greek culture spread through the whole world. At the end, we could just use Aristotle's life as the time when Greek culture spread through the whole world, even though it spread because of Alexander. And in philosophy, it's good to think of Aristotle as the time when Greek philosophy really took over the whole world. So if we look at that, we can see that right at the end of Aristotle's life, that's when Euclid was born. Okay, so Euclid was born into a Greek world. He was born into the world that had been conquered by Alexander the Great, and into a world that was very different from the world that Pythagoras or Socrates lived in. Euclid was born into a world that was dominated by Greek language and culture and philosophy, or was beginning to become dominated by those things. So That's the time when Euclid wrote. Notice that he's after all of these philosophers. He's after Thales and Pythagoras and Plato and Aristotle in being born in 325. So really, he's working around 280 to 265 BC. Okay, Euclid. He's the author of this book. Now, when we get into the study of Euclid's elements, we're not to think that Euclid wrote all this stuff. Euclid didn't discover all of these things that are contained in his book on the elements of geometry. These were things that were discussed and worked on by people for centuries and centuries. And little by little, philosophers made discoveries and developed proofs for different ideas. And then what Euclid did that was so helpful was that he gathered all of that stuff together and organized it into one source. So the elements of Euclid are like a summary of all of the knowledge of geometry that had been developed by the ancient philosophers. And of course, Euclid contributed to that a lot, but he's not responsible for all of it. It's a collection of all of the geometrical wisdom that had been established and developed by ancient philosophers throughout history. Okay, so make sure you understand the time when this book was put together, who put it together, how it was put together, and what its purpose was. And we're going to talk about its purpose in just a minute. But Euclid is the author of the elements of geometry, and in history, he's usually presented as the representative of them, as the master of geometry. Okay, Euclid. So make sure you know that name. And the book is called Euclid's Elements of Geometry. Okay, that's what we're going to study in classical geometry, Euclid's Elements of Geometry. And I'll explain in a little bit why it's called the Elements of Geometry and what that means, because it's very important. So we've seen the chronology of the ancient mathematicians. We see where Euclid is in that chronology down here in the Hellenistic world. So now what I want to show you here is what the ancient Greeks believed about mathematics and why they gave so much attention to mathematics. And I want you to see that it has nothing to do with modern school mathematics. And this is really important. They did not study these subjects because they were trying to figure out how to, how to build a spaceship and fly to the moon. That's not what they were trying to do. I explained this recently that all the study of mathematical calculations, is really not what the Greeks considered mathematics. That's called logistic. Logistic is the study of calculation. So to learn how to count things, to learn how to calculate money, to learn how to do the kind of math that one like Albert Einstein did when he would calculate all kind of physics problems and solutions. That's not classical mathematics. That's what's called logistic. It's just the science of calculation, learning how to calculate things, all different kinds of operations, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, percentages, square roots, exponents, all that kind of stuff. That's all considered logistic. It's just for calculation. And that's why many students in school, when they're studying those things, they ask the question, when am I ever going to use this, right? Like if you get into algebra, for example, you could be 14 years old, 15 years old, and you're in an algebra class and you're learning about quadratic equations. And you may ask yourself, when am I ever going to use this in my life? And the answer is probably never. You're probably never going to use that in your life. But if you ask a teacher, if you ask a math teacher, they'll try to give you some philosophical explanation for how algebra helps this and that and how it's necessary like this. And they may even be crazy enough to say, oh, well, in the ancient world, the philosophers taught that mathematics was like necessary for wisdom. And they'll try to give you all of these baloney answers. And the truth is, you're probably never going to use it. That's the truth. And that's a real source of frustration for students because they lack motivation to study what really is a very, very advanced form of calculation that very, very few people have any real interest in or will ever use. And that's just a fact. And then if you say something like, well, I can just do this with a calculator. If I ever need to do this, I can just enter these figures into a computer or a calculator, and I can get the calculation done by these machines. And the teachers will say things like, well, you never know. You might not have your... Look, I'm never going to have to solve a quadratic equation in a situation where I don't have a calculator or a computer. I'm not going to be like trapped in the Amazon rainforest and suddenly need to calculate, solve a quadratic equation to save my life. That's not going to happen. So if that's the argument that algebra depends on, it's really ridiculous. Of course, we're going to have calculators. Of course, we're going to have computers. So calculation really doesn't require our attention, because we can have machines do the calculations for us. And modern math teachers, because the technology is making their studies look ridiculous, modern teachers will say, you're not allowed to use calculators on this test. And just think how dumb that is, right? We're making the argument that technology is good. That's why we need math and science in the first place. We want to study math and science because we want to be able to work in a high-tech society. But then we're going to say the technology that's been developed, you're not allowed to use it. So we're just going to spite ourselves and force kids to work as if there's no technology in a course that is being taught to them because we say that technology is so important. You just see the problem in modern education. It's like they can't get out of their own way. And what they're doing really doesn't make sense, because they've tried to make the study of calculation to be this big focus of modern schools. And it's something that you can do on a computer or a calculator and really don't need to study so much. What we should actually be studying is not the science of calculation, because that's simple. What we should be studying is classical mathematics, because that's actually beneficial for our life as human beings. It's philosophical, it's moral, it helps us with religious thinking and stuff like that. And so I want to look at this document here, which is taken from a book called Plato's Republic, book 7 of Plato's Republic, because there Plato explains what should be studied in mathematics and why. And I think this has a lot more, what should I say, application to the Christian life than modern math studies, which, we have to do them because they've been made requirements for, let's say, college admission. You have to have 3 or 4 years of mathematics. So there's nothing we can do about that except try to get it done as efficiently as possible. But the real focus of our studies in mathematics should not be on the science of calculation. It should be in philosophical math studies. So I want to show you what the Greek philosophers actually taught about mathematics and where these mathematical sciences actually came from, all right? So this document up on the screen, all I did was I copied the whole entire text from book 7 of Plato's Republic. And it's a dialogue. The way Plato's books work is that he writes dialogue. So it's like a conversation between different people. There's tons and tons of space and time wasted in Plato's dialogues. I think he does it on purpose so that lazy people will just give up. But there's tons and tons of content. And what I've done is I've just deleted all of that stuff, all the extra, all the unnecessary conversation, all the unnecessary information. I've just deleted it all. And the whole book 7, the whole 7th book of Plato's Republic is summarized on this page. This is really what it teaches us, okay? These are the important points of book 7 of Plato's Republic, all right? And I want to go through this with you. So what's happening in Plato's Republic is Socrates is having a discussion with some other Greek men, and they're talking about what the perfect government would be, what the perfect state would be. And they're arguing about how the state should be organized, how the people should be organized, how things should work, and so on. And in book 7, they come to the topic of education. So in book 7, they talk about how the leaders of this state, this perfect state, how they should be educated, what they need to study in order to become great leaders and be able to serve the people effectively. And, lo and behold, they say that they should study philosophy. They should study the classical liberal arts and philosophy. But more specifically, Socrates argues that they need to study the mathematical arts, the classical mathematical arts. And he explains what the classical mathematical arts are and how they should be studied and why they should be studied. He explains the goal of the mathematical arts. Okay. And I've summarized everything he says in that book on this page here. So it's a really helpful guide to what the ancient Greeks, and remember, this was Socrates speaking in the dialogue, but it's Plato writing the book. Okay, Plato comes after Socrates. So let's just walk through this, and we're going to focus on geometry and astronomy because that's the subject of this live class. So as he's talking about this and asking, what do the leaders need to learn in order to be the best possible men, the best possible leaders? And this is what he says. This is the first principle. The best minds must continue to ascend until they arrive at the good. And this is philosophical language, so it can be annoying, but it's easy to understand once you learn how Socrates and Plato think about things. The best minds, that is, the men who will become the leaders, they need to continue to ascend through their studies, continue to ascend until they arrive at the good. And notice that good is a capital G, right? Arrive at the good. So to ascend, what that means is they have to rise up above the thoughts and discussions and stuff of the common people. They can't be caught up in all the nonsense of the common people. They can't be caught up in all of this wrestling and fighting and complaining about what they're going to eat, what they're going to wear, what they're going to drink, where they're going to live, all of this worldly stuff. They can't be caught up in that. They have to ascend beyond that intellectually. Their minds have to be set on nobler things. And they have to continue to ascend, not just be a little bit better. They have to continue to ascend in their studies and meditation until they arrive at the good. That's the idea. And what he means by the good is until they arrive at the contemplation of everything that is perfect. And of course, for us, we would simply call that God. That what he calls the good, we would call God. God is the good. But for Plato, remember, this is before Christianity, so they don't have all of this Christian teaching provided to them. They're doing the best they can with what they understand. And they say, the best men must study so that they can grow intellectually above all of the stuff of modern life. They're not going to be wrapped up in all the news headlines and all of this junk, right? They've got to ascend until their minds are focused on the capital G, good. And it's important to note that the English word God is actually derived from the word good. So those two words are related to each other. All right. So that's the goal of education for Plato. It's to have people ascend intellectually until they have their minds fixed on the ultimate good, the highest good. And that's what makes them good men. That's what will actually enable them to do good works, because they're to ascend and learn these things and understand these things, and then turn around and descend and go and help their neighbor. So think about the incarnation, right? Jesus comes down from the good. He comes down from God to help and save the world. That's what good men are supposed to do. They're supposed to ascend through their own studies, through philosophical studies. They're supposed to ascend until they have come to the good. And then once they're there, they're then to turn around and go back down and help their fellow men. That's how the leaders are to be trained, right? And that's why classical Catholic studies were always the way that priests were trained, saints studied, philosophers and kings and rulers studied, on and on. That's why classical Catholic education was throughout Catholic history. I could just say classical education, but through Catholic centuries, classical Catholic education was the only education that there was. So the best minds must continue to ascend until they arrive at the good. And then Socrates explains how they can do this. How do we do this? How do we start to do this? How do we even begin to think the way we're supposed to think? How do we begin? Now, let me ask you this, and you can just chat the answer. Why does the church fill the sanctuary with statues and paintings and stained glass windows? Why does the church do that? Any idea why the church does that? To inspire us. Yeah, that's a good answer. Think about it. They have statues of Jesus, of the crucifixion, of the Virgin Mary. They've got stained glass windows with images from the life of Christ. They've got paintings of saints on the walls. What are some other reasons why they do that? To honor them, sure. But that's not really why. Lara's on the right track. What's the purpose of those sacred objects or holy images? What's the purpose? You know what the purpose is? What the real purpose is? Yeah, Lara, you're getting closer and closer. Yeah. You see what the purpose is, there's nothing special about, I mean, think about it. It's kind of dumb if you think about it to say, I'm going to look at a statue of the Virgin Mary so that I can pray, right? And Catholics get criticized for that, and they get criticized for a good reason, because if we don't understand the purpose, we can miss the whole point, okay? We believe that the Blessed Virgin Mary is alive today, not just as some spirit someplace in heaven. We believe that she was assumed body and soul into heaven. Now, if we think about that, it's kind of hard to make sense of. Mary exists in heaven and she's in a body. So she's somewhere because she's a body. So she's somewhere. So when we pray the Hail Mary, we're not talking to an angel. It's not like praying to a guardian angel. We're not talking to a spirit. We're talking to a woman who has been risen from the dead and assumed body and soul into this place called heaven. We're talking to a living woman, body and soul in heaven. Jesus as well. He's not a spirit up in heaven someplace. Jesus was resurrected from the dead and ascended into heaven, body and soul. And so to think about that, it just sort of makes our heads spin, right? Where is this body? Where would they be? What is heaven? It's hard to even understand what we're talking about unless we really get into it and study it and meditate on it to think rightly about it. We're supposed to be praying not to just a bunch of spirits. The saints are different. The saints are currently just spirits because they haven't been resurrected yet. But the Virgin Mary and Jesus Christ, their body and soul in heaven. So we're praying to living physical beings who currently dwell in heaven. And that's very hard to understand. So the church will put a statue of the Virgin Mary in front of us. We're not supposed to pray to the statue. The statue is intended to be a help. It's to help us think of the Virgin Mary as a physical bodily person to whom we're praying. But we're supposed to contemplate and go beyond that statue and think about the real Mary, body and soul in heaven. We're supposed to do that work of ascending through the statue with the help of the statue, but ascending above it to the reality of the bodily Mary in heaven in the presence of God. So the statue is intended to help us. Images of Christ, images of the crucifix, images of his resurrected body, paintings of the life of Christ. They help us to think of Christ not as a spirit, because that's not what he is. They help us to think of him as a living man, even though he's divine, and that's a mystery. But we're praying to Christ as a living man, body and soul in heaven. So those images are intended to help us to contemplate and think of those things. But we're supposed to go through them with our thoughts and above and beyond them to actually think about the realities that are difficult for us to think about. Most people will just think of Jesus as a spirit in heaven. You know, he's just God. He's a spirit. We just talk to the spirit. We trust that the spirit knows our thoughts and so on. Mary, we're just talking to the spirit of Mary, you know, wherever that spirit's just kind of everywhere, I guess. But that's not what we're doing. We're talking to living people, body and soul, in heaven and offering prayers to persons. And that's very different. And the images are meant to help us because that contemplation is challenging for us, and most people don't do it. That process of using material things like paintings, statues, crucifixes, and so on, using them to help us go beyond them and contemplate the realities of those things, which are very difficult to think about. That process is the same exact process that Socrates explains mathematics allows us to do. Okay, so that process of using things that are here with us, using things that we can see and touch, but not stopping there, but going beyond them. That's the purpose of mathematics, okay? So just like the statues and paintings and images in church are not meant to be the focus of our prayers. We're not praying to the statue. We're using the statue to help us think about bodily Mary in heaven because we believe in the assumption. In the same way, these mathematical sciences help us to do that same thing. They help us to look out at the world, think about things in the world, and use them to ascend beyond them to higher things that exist, you know, in the spiritual world or in the mind of God, which is what Plato is trying to understand through philosophy. Okay, so this is explained here by Socrates, and I just want to read some of these to you because you'll see what I'm talking about. Socrates says, the philosopher, and you'll start to understand what all this philosophical language means because he uses illustrations and figures of speech to explain these things. The philosopher, because he has to rise out of the sea of change, rise out of the sea of change. He says the world that we live in is like an ocean where everything is just unstable, constantly changing. Things are being created, things are dying, there's decay, everything is constantly changing. We can't have any stability. Our souls can't focus on anything in this world because it's all constantly changing. So a wise man wants to rise beyond this world of constant change and unstable things and confusion. He wants to rise above that so he can fix his soul on things that never change, things that are eternal. The philosopher has to rise out of the sea of change and lay hold of true being, lay hold of things that exist without ever changing, things that are real, like Nicomachus says in Arithmetic. Therefore, the philosopher must be an arithmetician. He must study arithmetic. He must carry on the study. He must carry on the study of arithmetic until he sees the nature of numbers with his mind only. So that's the goal. Just like we look at the statue so that we can look at the language he says here, until we can see the nature of Christ with the mind only. You see that idea of what contemplation is? That's what arithmetic is as well. He must carry on the study of arithmetic until he is able to see the nature of numbers with the mind only. So that's the goal. So we start out as little kids. We start out counting objects, right? Here's a pile of beans. Count how many beans are there. Here's a pile of pennies. Count how many pennies there are. We use physical objects to learn to understand what numbers are, what numbers mean. You know, 7 pennies. We count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. We hold them in our hand. We say 7 pennies. And then we take something else and we count that. But the goal of arithmetic is not to do that. It's not to calculate things. The goal of arithmetic is to ask the question, what exactly is 7? What's significant about the number 7? And you may say, well, there's nothing significant about the number 7. It's just a number, right? It's just a number. Well, if that's true, then why are there 7 days in a week? Is that just random? When God created the world and established 7 days a week, just random? Or is there a reason? Is there some significance in the nature of the number 7? Why are there, yeah, it's one more than 6, but the point is, why 7? Why not 8? Why not 12? Why is there a week at all? Why do we even talk about weeks? Why don't we just make 30 different day names and just have one day each day of the month, and there's just 30 days and that's it? Why do we have this 7 days of the week? Why can't the week be 4 days? Is Sunday really different? What if we just have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then just start it over again? Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and just lived like that. Why is there 7? It's not random. There's reason because of the nature of numbers. Why are there 24 hours in the day? Is it just random, or is there some significance? Why do we say that a circle has 360 degrees? Is that just random, or is there some significance? Why do we have 10 fingers on our hands? Is that just random, or is there some significance to the number of fingers and toes we have? You see, so when we get into these things, we can see when God created the world, he didn't create things random. It's not like a Star Wars, when Han Solo and Chewbacca go into the bar in the first Star Wars movie, and there's just all these random monsters in there. They're all totally different. Their heads are all different sizes and shapes. They've got all these different features. That's not how the world is. Every human being has 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 hands, 2 feet, 2 lungs. And so we see that every single human being, when God created them, he created them, and number was a part of the design of everything. Number was a part of the design. And so when we seek to understand the world we live in, and we seek to understand God as well, God actually uses number to design things. It's not random. And so the goal of arithmetic is to go deeper into this study and ask, what is the significance of these numbers? What is the nature of these numbers? And to try to understand. Now, some of you, I don't know about all of you, but I know at least 2 of you have started classical arithmetic, and you've made your way through a bunch of these studies, and you've seen some of this. You've seen Nicomachus in arithmetic talk about the significance of the number 1, and how do we know it's actually the first number, right? And he explains and proves why the number 1 is significant, and it is the first number. And then he talks about the number 2, and he talks about qualities of the number 2, the significance of the nature of the number 2, and so on. When Aristotle talks in the physics and he asks, how many elements is the world made of? And he says there are 4. He argues from the nature of the number 4 that that's a reasonable answer, because it makes sense why there would be 4 elements in the world and not 1 or not 2 or not an infinite number. Why 4 would be a reasonable number for the elements of the world. So if you've been in arithmetic, in classical arithmetic, you've already started to see Nicomachus explaining some of these things, right? You've learned about like the perfect numbers, even and odd numbers, different kinds of even and odd numbers. You're learning about the nature and characteristics of numbers, which is taking you beyond counted stuff in the world to the contemplation of numbers themselves. And that's just the beginning of philosophy. Okay, learning to think like that, learning to think about abstract things. That's the beginning of philosophy. That's contemplation. That's what it means to be contemplative. Okay. So Socrates argues that we need to study arithmetic and continue the study until we see the nature of numbers with the mind only. We're not counting things. We're not using beads. We're talking about numbers themselves as abstract ideas, and considering the nature of numbers, okay? Then he goes on to geometry, and this is where it gets important for us here. The knowledge at which geometry aims. So if I were to ask you, what's the goal of geometry? What's the purpose of geometry? People start talking about all kinds of stuff. Oh, you can calculate, how much area there is in a field. You can figure out how to calculate, what the volume of a swimming pool is, right? You can figure out how much water you need. You see how that's all material? You're just calculating stuff. You're still down in the world with all of this changing material stuff. That's just calculation. That's not geometry, okay? That's just more logistics. You're calculating. That's not geometry. Read what Socrates says the purpose of geometry is. The knowledge at which geometry aims is knowledge of the eternal. The knowledge at which geometry aims is knowledge of the eternal, not of anything perishing and transient. That means changing its form and existence. So the knowledge that geometry aims at is not the knowledge of physical bodies or solids or things that exist in the world. It's not about calculating the area of a field or the volume of a swimming pool or anything like that. Geometry aims at a knowledge of what is eternal, not of anything that perishes. And look what he says here. Geometry will draw the soul towards truth. And I should make that a capital T. Geometry will draw the soul towards truth. And this is the most important part. Geometry will create the spirit of philosophy in a person. Geometry will create the spirit of philosophy. So that's our goal in the study of geometry, to create the spirit of philosophy, and I'll make that a capital P, to create in us the spirit of philosophy. That is, to teach us, to train us how to be contemplative, how to think like a contemplative. So when you hear about all these saints like Saint Catherine of Siena, and you hear that, oh, she was contemplative, and he was contemplative, and they were contemplative, and people chose to enter into religious life so that they could live as contemplatives, and it was called the contemplative life. This is what they're talking about. This is what Saint Catherine of Siena was doing with her life. She was a contemplative, okay? She was learning and studying to think philosophically with the spirit of philosophy, and she spent her time thinking about God. Saint Dominic, it was said that he only talked about two things. He either talked to God in prayer, or he talked about God. He never talked about anything else. That's a contemplative. And the goal of these studies, arithmetic, geometry, music, astronomy, is to help us to begin to learn how to be contemplative. It's the beginning of philosophy. Geometry creates in us the spirit of philosophy. Not if we take a modern geometry class and just learn a bunch of nonsense about shapes and figures and how to calculate volume and area and stuff like that. That's not what we're talking about. That's just calculation. We're talking about real classical geometry, and the goal is to create the spirit of philosophy in us and help us to become contemplative. That's the goal of geometry, all right? Next, we have astronomy. And let me just get into this because this is going to be a geometry and astronomy live class. Astronomy is the third important study for the best minds. The spangled heavens. So if we look up at the sky and see all the stars and things like that, we say, well, astronomy is the study of the stars, right? Astronomy is like trying to understand the zodiac and the different seasons and how all of the different celestial bodies move and the constellations and things like that. That's the study of astronomy, right? Socrates says, no, that's not the purpose of astronomy. Just like the statue is not the object of our thoughts in church. The heavens are just the help that help us to move beyond the heavens in our thoughts. He says, the spangled heavens should be used as a pattern with a view to that higher knowledge. So the heavens just introduce us to things that allow us to then go beyond those things and think not about the stars or the sun or the moon, but think about the creator of the stars and the sun and the moon, to ask the question, why? Why was the moon made to do what it does? What's the significance of the moon? Why was the sun created like this? What's the purpose of the sun? What's the purpose of all of these stars? When we go to the book of Genesis, Moses tells us that, right? He says God created these things to be for seasons and for signs, for days and for years. So when we look at them, we shouldn't say, wow, that's cool. Look, I made a calendar, the end. That's not the purpose. It's to think about them, to understand what they do for us, but then to go beyond them and think, God designed these things. This is how God thinks. This is how God does things, right? God actually designed the sun to do all of these things, to give light to the earth, to give warmth to the earth, and so on. He made a sun that is able to burn for centuries and centuries and centuries and centuries. How did he do that? How does that work? Scientists can't explain how that works. They tell us it's a big ball of gas. Why doesn't it explode, right? Is it ever going to run out? They'll come up with theories, but they can't prove any of the things that they say. How did God create a sun that just burns and burns for centuries and centuries and never dies? Well, think about Moses in the burning bush. God could cause a bush to go on fire and the bush never burned up. It's the same idea. You see that? It's a sign of divine power, that something can happen that there's no real explanation for, just like the burning bush, and the sun just continues burning, and it causes us to contemplate and think of the mysterious power of God, who could design such a thing and cause it to give light and heat to the earth. And then we think about things like, if the sun was closer, we'd all die. If the sun was further away, we'd all die. Yet the sun somehow remains in the exact right place to make the earth just warm enough for us to live and for seasons to change, to allow all these plants and animals to live. And if it changed just a few degrees, like all the climate change people warn, we'd die and things would start to be destroyed. And yet it doesn't. It goes on for centuries and centuries and centuries, just perfectly arranged. And that's mysterious. And it introduces us to contemplative thoughts, okay? Astronomy, as in geometry, should employ problems. And notice what he says, leave the heavens alone. Right? We're not trying to explore the heavens and study the stars and the planets. We're not trying to go to Mars or go live on the moon. That's stupid. Leave the heavens alone, he says. The real purpose of the heavens is for us to contemplate and ascend beyond them philosophically and meditate on the source of them, the cause of them, because wise men seek to know the causes of things, all right? So that's the goal of astronomy. Yes, we want to study the heavens, we want to learn about the heavens, but the goal of those studies is to go beyond those studies, okay? And then he says the same thing of music. Music is also mysterious. You hear a sound. I know, Joy, you play the harp. I don't know about any others of you. I love the classical Catholic radio station, I play a lot of what's called Renaissance polyphony, is a type of music, and the clarinet, great. Saxophone, great. And hopefully you have some opportunity to play, with other instruments in sort of an orchestra or something like that. But, we play music, we learn music, we hear music, but the question is, sometimes we hear something and we say, oh, this is so beautiful. This piece is so beautiful. This piece by Mozart, listen to this one part. Oh, it's so beautiful. And what's strange, well, piano is even better example, because on the piano you play chords, right? And so the question would be, for the piano, why are those three notes special, right? You strike those three notes and you say, ah, that sounds nice. That sounds beautiful, right? And then you hit three other keys and you say, ugh, that's like scratching your fingernails down the chalkboard. That sounds terrible. What you see is, if you ask the question, why, if you go beyond the piano lesson, who cares about the piano lesson, right? Go beyond the piano lesson, go beyond the names of the chords and how you play the chords and all this kind of stuff. Go beyond that and ask, why are these three notes a chord? And why are these three notes not a chord? Why do these three notes, when I hear them, my soul says, ah, that sounds nice. And if I play these three notes, my soul says, that does not sound nice. What's actually the cause of that reaction to these sounds? There's something more mysterious going on here. There's something about music that can lead us to contemplation. And the ancient philosophers actually showed that it has to do with number. There's mathematics in music that is the cause of these different reactions in our soul. If you open up the piano, what do you find? You find just a bunch of metal strings of different thicknesses and lengths. So if I have a string of this length and I have a string of this length, thank you, Sarah. Sorry, I'm running a little bit over. It'll be recorded, so you can just catch the rest. I'll be quick here. I'm just going to wrap up soon. If you look inside the piano, you see it's just a bunch of strings that are different lengths. And so if I hit this length and this length and this length, the relationship between those numbers is pleasant. If I hit this length and this length and this length, the relationship between those numbers is unpleasant. Well, Pythagoras went to work on that to try to figure out what it is. And so music theory is actually a mathematical theory that explains why certain what are called intervals are harmonious or pleasant and why others are not. But it leads us to the question, why? Why are these numbers pleasant to our souls? You know, what's the significance of that? So music too becomes a means of contemplation if we study it rightly. And that's the purpose of classical music, okay? One last thing I want to share, because I know we're out of time here, okay? One last thing I want to share. So my goal is that you understand what the goal is for classical mathematics. You understand what's different about classical mathematics and modern school mathematics. We have to do the modern school math, but we need to do it as efficiently as possible. We can't waste tons of time doing that. There's not going to be any reward for devoting tons and tons of time just to get good at calculation. It's not the right use of our time. The purpose of these studies is to create in us the spirit of philosophy, to prepare us for not just philosophy, but also for the Catholic life, which is a contemplative life by its nature, okay? The book we're going to be studying is Euclid's Elements. The next document that I prepared for you, which is very important, is this document here on my screen. What I've done here is gone through all of book 1 of Euclid's Elements and pulled all of the points that we learn in book 1, all the definitions, all the postulates, all the axioms, and all the propositions. Everything from book 1 is on this one document. So you could print it out and stick it in a notebook and hold on to it. What we're going to study in classical geometry is everything on this document. So we're just going to work through this. We'll start next week. We'll go through the definitions and stuff and make sure we understand what they're talking about, because you probably don't understand, you know, even though you may read that and think, okay, I understand it. A point is that which has, okay, I understand. You really don't, because remember, the goal of this is contemplation. So there's more to this stuff than there may appear at first. So we're going to go through this and I'll explain all that and help you with it. But this document here, if you print that out, you can work on memorizing the content of this document little by little, and you'll have everything you need to know for the first 50 lessons of classical geometry, okay? All the important content that you need to know and should memorize if you really want to commit to this study is on this one document, okay? So that's very helpful. So you have all the stuff that you need. We had a good introduction, I think, to this study. And so next week, when we have this geometry class, we'll start going through the elements. And I'll explain a little bit more what the elements are, what the book actually does, and so on. But we're going to stop there for now, okay? So I'm going to stop the recording here. I hope that that was helpful. If you've got any questions or if any of that was not clear, just let me know during our chat time, and we can talk about anything more. But I'm going to wrap up for this live class on the recording. All right. Let me just stop sharing and also stop recording.